Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Edwards, before the break, you mentioned the board briefing of the 26th of July. I'm just going to bring that up onto screen so that we can confirm that this is the document that you were talking about. It's poll 406590. Is this the document you were referring to?
Yes, it is.
Were you involved in the drafting of this document?
I was, yes. I kind of coordinated the preparation of this.
Is it at this point in time where there seems to be a movement towards restricting the involvement of Second Sight or limiting their involvement going forwards?
I think the discussion around Second Sight's ongoing role had probably been iterating for a number of weeks leading up to this and beyond it. So I'm not sure it was particularly the development of this report. I think it was about this time.
That individuals' thoughts are gathering as to the future for Second Sight and limiting their input.
The question I recall at the time was, there was clearly a cohort of cases which had been submitted as part of the first phase of the Second Sight investigation. I think it was about 47. And I think the debate is, do they just focus on them? Is there a role beyond that? So those were the types of questions being raised.
Thank you. I think in your document pack there's a reference to just keeping it at 47. Do you recall that?
Yes, I recall that being a suggestion from some of the business.
Thank you. That can come down. I'm going to move to a different topic, and that is the flotation prospectus. I think you said that you weren't involved in the flotation of Royal Mail itself.
Not itself, but I mean, as I'm sure we'll come on to, I was involved at one point in providing some comments on specific references to Post Office in the prospectus.
Could we please turn to UKGI 401916? If we look at the second email on the page, it's an email from Mr. Davis to yourself, to Will Gibson at Shex, and he says, just want to touch base on prospectus, which I know you've talked to Susan about. Royal Mail described it to me as a BIS document, that's Department for Business document, but I think you don't share that view. Anyway, the unvarnished risk section is very problematic. It highlights all the risks which NFSP and others claim, and therefore supports the campaign. I don't suggest such risks should not be discussed, but it does so badly without mitigation and is poorly drafted in places, specifically on Horizon. And then if we scroll up, thank you. Mr. Gibson has responded. You're copied into this correspondence. And he says, hi, Mark, I share your concerns, and we've gone back to Royal Mail on them. I sent the comments we sent over to Susan, so feel free to have a look. The Royal Mail suggestion, it's our document, is nonsense. Slaughters are holding the pen, and Royal Mail directors are responsible for it. That said, we can certainly influence its drafting, as I'd be keen to ensure in this case. So the complaint there from Mr. Davis, if we scroll down, is about the risk section. We can then see what happens to that risk section. Could we please turn to poll 00381531? Now, there is an email from Mark Davis on the second page to Paula Vemmels, and she has inserted some words in capitals. So if we scroll up slightly, we can see her response. It's a little bit more, thank you. So she's responded to Mr. Davis and said, Mark, thank you, this is very helpful. I've made some comments below in caps. NB, if someone can show me how to change the colour, that'd be far more effective. If we scroll down, we can see Mr. Davis's email to Paula Vennells and also her response. And it's the bottom of that page that I'd just like to take you to. He says, RMG prospectus. We are working with legal on this. The section on risks is very problematic for Post Office. The PR team are across it, and I've asked Mike to also work on it from his perspective. And then that's the response from Paula Vennells in capitals, am aware, thanks. What was the purpose of the prospectus?
So it was clearly Royal Mail's documents to inform prospective buyers for their shares.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 002999534? And if we could start on the second page, please. So this is your involvement. If we look at the bottom of page 2. An email from Tim McInnes from Shex. He says, Martin, and that's a reference to you, can you let me know the time/status of Post Office's most recent conversations with Royal Mail on the prospectus? We think someone on the other side might be saying that the Post Office has signed off, and to bat this away, which we will, it would be useful to understand comms channels and what has been said/agreed. And further to our chat a few minutes ago, it would be good if you can leave this with us for the moment. We will keep you updated on progress in real time, but there are some weapons we want to keep in the arsenal and only use if they're absolutely necessary. We have a couple of avenues to try still, so let's see where we get to with those. Why is Tim McInnes contacting you specifically?
Part of my role as Chief of Staff, and I think I referred to this, my witness statement was to be part of an informal line of communication into the Shex and Biz teams. So they were in contact with lots of people in the Post Office, but if they weren't sure where to go, they could pick up the phone to me and I could help them out and direct them to the right place. So that was part of my role.
Were there others assigned to that role, or was that a role that you specifically held?
I'd say the comms team had primary accountability for government relations. I think my role was particularly to help be that an additional line of communication into the Biz and Shex teams.
Because it's not just communications that you need that relationship with Shex, it's also because they have a seat on the board and there is a direct line of accountability of some sort, isn't there?
Yes, yeah, clearly had interests across the full span of the business.
If we scroll up, the response from yourself, Tim, the only other channel of communication with Royal Mail on the prospectus has been between our legal team, Susan and Hugh, who I've copied, and lawyer at Slaughters. Hugh can confirm, but as far as I'm aware, the last communication with them was 1 to 2 weeks ago and focused on narrower points of legal/factual detail rather than reputational/PR issues that I flagged to you. What were those issues that you had flagged?
I think the context for this, there was a huge amount of anxiety at the time about the separation of Royal Mail and Post Office, a lot of anxiety from the network, from the NFSP, from the CW about what repercussions this would have for the long-term relationship between Post Office and Royal Mail. And so I think that the particular concerns were, as you'd expect in a risk statement, there were lots of quite extensive description of risks about the relationship between Post Office and Royal Mail, raising the possibility that relationship could break, raising risks about our operational dependability. And I think our concern was, whilst we recognised prospectus by definition needs to be clear to investors about prospective risks, we were concerned that without the right context, that would kind of play into some of these anxieties of the network about what impact separation would have.
But of course, a risk section in a prospectus has to be absolutely accurate about the risks that the company faces.
Yes, yeah, and obviously what we're trying to find the right balance here is factual description of risks, but making sure they're understood in the right context.
Thank you. Could we turn to the first page, please? bottom of the first page. You email Susan Crichton and Hugh Flemington. Would you be able to ask Slaughters to send across the latest extracts on the post office from the prospectus, please? Just spoke to Will G for an update from their perspective. He said the main sticking point was the sentence on Horizon/Second Sight in the IT risks section, which they're still pushing to have removed, but are facing some resistance. I asked if that meant the other issues have been resolved on MDA language, etc. What was MDA language?
MDA, that was the Master Distribution Agreement. So that was the long-term agreement between Post Office and Royal Mail. So that governed our ongoing relationship post-separation.
He said he didn't think that there was any pushback there, but wasn't able to confirm whether or not our comments have been taken on board. He said he would do some digging, but it might be quicker just to get hold of the latest language direct from Slaughters. So at this point, there were two issues principally with the prospectus. One of them was about language relating to Horizon/Second Sight, and the other was on the MDA language. Is that right?
Yes, the MDA language, that broader ongoing relationship between Post Office and Royal Mail.
The response from Susan Crichton: we can't go direct to Slaughters. They will have to ask RMG to approve, giving us the information. So I will ask Royal Mail. But as I understand it, the Horizon IT reference was taken directly from our press release. And you say, thanks, Susan. Looks like none of our changes have been taken on board. Susan Crichton responds, so are you going back to Biz? Not sure our protesting about this will make any difference. And you say, yes, I'll pick up with Biz and keep you posted. Could we please turn to UKGI 402065? If we scroll down slightly, an email from Mr. McInnes to Mr. Gibson at Shecs and also to yourself. He says, Will, Martin, see below an extract from an email just received from Freshfields related to the Horizon disclosure. Martin, I want to wait till for the fat lady to sing, but it looks like you managed to make more progress, or rather progress, than we could at this end. Many thanks for taking the baton. And the extract from the email is, the Horizon language is still in the draft, but I spoke to Alex Dunn just now, and he says that all of the Horizon disclosure will be taken out today, which is good news. And if we scroll up, we can see your response. Thanks, Tim. That's very good to hear. We intervened with John M. last night. Is that John Millage?
Yes, I believe so.
And he was the company secretary of Royal Mail.
Yes.
Last night, and he said he would pick this up with the team. Now we can see how that occurred, and I'm going to take you to correspondence between Paula Venables and Mr. Millage that is referred to there. Could we please turn to poll 001464662? And could we start at the bottom of page 2, please? Thank you. So this is a Friday night email from Ms. Venables to Mr. Millage. And she says, hi, John. I realise this is ridiculously late, and for that, my sincere apologies. However, I have just seen an email that our team in Biz appear to have hit a brick wall on this particular paragraph in the prospectus. And I'm told it has to be lodged with UKLA by 8 a.m. on Monday. And this is the passage that has been objected to from the prospectus. In July 2013, an interim report was published into alleged problems with Post Office's Horizon computer system, which is used to record transactions in its branch network. The report confirmed that no system-wide problems had been found in relation to the Horizon software, but suggests that the Post Office should examine its support and training processes for sub-postmasters. That was accurate as a statement, wasn't it?
Yes, I think the statement itself was accurate, and as we saw in the early exchanges, I think it had been lifted from a Post Office press notice.
And Ms. Venables says below, our challenge is that this is not a risk to Royal Mail, and it is particularly misleading in the IT risks section. As your paragraph states, the findings of the interim report related to sub-postmaster training and support, not IT faults. Do you agree with that fine distinction?
I mean, yes, we didn't see this as a risk to Royal Mail at that point, and as described in the email, the key finding from the second site interim report was around postmaster training and support. We didn't at that point see it as a IT system. It was the broader process of support and training. So yes, it felt like that was the right summing up in Paula's email.
So in your view, the second site report was not addressing IT issues. It was relating simply to the sub-postmaster training and support.
No, it clearly addressed both, but the major finding, the major focus was particularly around training and support.
And was that training and support generally, or training and support in relation to the Horizon system?
In relation to use of the Horizon system, yes.
And therefore, is it inappropriate for that to have been included in a section under IT?
I think it was felt to be inappropriate in a section on Royal Mail IT risks. That felt like a kind of inappropriate place to be talking about this risk.
We can read here the feeling that it's inappropriate as expressed by Ms. Reynolds, but what is your personal view? Is there an issue with what was in a press line relating to the second site report, which was an investigation into the Horizon IT system, being in a section in a prospectus under the IT section?
I think I would agree with the assessment that repeating language about the findings of the second site reports in a section on Royal Mail IT risks doesn't accurately describe the nature of that risk. So it does feel to me like a fair concern.
Was it a risk? The matters that were identified by second site, were they a risk more broadly to the Royal Mail?
Not as we understood them to be at the time, no.
So they are not risks that would have affected the Royal Mail Group?
We didn't perceive them to be. I think clearly the chief concern at this stage was reputational risks for Post Office.
It says, can you get this paragraph removed? Alice had offered to contact Donald if necessary, but I don't want to disturb her this weekend. So sorry to bother you with this, and I recognise that the paragraph makes it clear there isn't an IT fault, but its present in an IT risk section potentially opens up a sensitive and politically high-profile situation. How would the inclusion of a line that is in a press, your own press line, potentially open up a sensitive and politically high-profile situation?
I think our feeling was the second site reports had been published. We had published our response to that second site report. All of that had been disclosed. Re-airing that particular information in the context of a Royal Mail prospectus and a section talking about Royal Mail IT risks. Clearly the concern was that, yes, it was kind of raising attention to that issue, and again, in the wrong context, and that was causing us some anxiety.
If we scroll up on page 2, we can see Mr. Milledge's response. I thought that this risk only repeated the press release and that your team were okay with it. Evidently not. So let me check with the team. I'll get back to you. And if we scroll up, Ms. Fennell says, it is just odd, therefore, that it features in an IT risks section. If we continue scrolling up, please. The response from Mr. Milledge, if if we scroll up to the bottom of the next page, yes, sorry, it's just there, at the bottom of this page, and that is the point I've just raised with the team, may be better under contract. So Mr. Millage is saying, okay, I get the point about it not going under IT. It should maybe be better under the contract section. Is that how you understand his email to suggest?
Yes.
And then Ms. Fennell says, no, John, the request is to remove it. It's not a Royal Mail contracts risk either. And then if we scroll up above, he says, okay, I think we should be able to remove, but I will need to confirm on Monday. And then if we look at the top email, Paula Venables to Alice Perkins, not sure how much you want keeping in the loop, but hoping it goes through. I've earned my keep on this one. Unusually, Biz misjudged it. They were unable to get the changes through and seemed to be unclear on how much time we had before the deadline. So we were told our luck and time had run out on Friday. Read bottom up. I hope it is now resolved. This seems to suggest quite a lot of micromanaging of information relating to the second site report. Would you agree with that?
I think I'd agree it reflects a high degree of anxiety about that information being recirculated what we felt to be out of context and clearly an extraordinarily high profile context. So yes, I think it reflects a high degree of anxiety about that.
And we saw before lunch your comment on the BBC article and their report on the interim report. Similar approach here, trying to clamp down on references to the second site's report and their findings. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I'd quite agree with that characterisation. As we discussed before lunch, the concern about that report wasn't reference to the second site report. It was the way it had been described to be an ongoing problem of Horizon. That was the specific concern here. We had published the second site report. We'd published our response to it. So I don't think it was an issue per se with that being in the public domain. I think it was an anxiety about how that information might be represented in the wrong context.
Could we please look at poll 0029995? This is an email from yourself, the 25th of September. You're emailing Mark Davis and others, and you say, Mark, Ruth and team, here is the latest and I understand final draft of the Post Office extracts from the Royal Mail prospectus. It's certainly much better than it was, and we managed to get the sentences on the second site review deleted. But the risk section is still inevitably negative in tone, whilst the standard audience for such documents, i.e. investors, would expect this and not take it out of context. Clearly journalists and unions may seek to misuse it. So I guess over to you guys to work with Biz and Royal Mail Communications on the defensive lines. Let me know if there's anything to do to help. I've asked Biz to see if they can get hold of wider marketing materials for the IPO, which will hopefully include some more positive statements on the Post Office Royal Mail relationship, but probably worth asking your counterparts in Royal Mail too, as they may be a quicker route. So significant efforts have been put into getting the second site review deleted from that report. Do you consider the actions that took place in relation to that prospectus to have been appropriate?
I think they do clearly reflect a very high degree of anxiety around the positioning of the second site report and how that was reflected. But as we see in this email, they also reflect broader anxiety about the whole separation process, which, I mean, this was one of the most seismic events to impact the Post Office in its history. So the whole process of Royal Mail separation and privatisation was intensely sensitive to the business.
It's editing a section on risks to investors. Surely it has been shown to be quite right that it is and was a very significant risk to investors. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure, to be honest, whether even in hindsight, this whole affair has represented a risk to Royal Mail per se. I'm not sure. I don't feel well placed to qualify on that. That wasn't my understanding.
In relation to the post office, though, it's been a significant risk. Would you agree with that?
It's clearly been a monumental risk to the post office, yes.
Just so that I can understand this, Mr. Edwards, in the emails that we've been going through, especially from Ms. Venables, as I read them at least, she was making it clear that the risk was to the post office. It was a post office risk, not a Royal Mail risk. And that was at least one of the reasons which was motivating her to ask that the risk be removed. Have I got that right?
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct, sir. Yeah, that was the key concern. We understood it to be a risk to the post office. It wasn't necessarily a risk to Royal Mail, which is why it felt inappropriate to be in a Royal Mail prospectus.
I mean, that debate about whether it should be under IT risks or contract risks, the point is made explicitly. It's not a risk to you, in effect. It's a risk to us.
Correct, yes.
Okay. So from your personal perspective at the time, were you looking at this as a risk to post office alone? Or were you thinking that there may be wider implications with there being a risk to Royal Mail?
I think I and everyone working on this was very much focused on the risk to post office. I really don't think the driver for this wasn't concerns around Royal Mail per se. We're very much looking to protect post office's reputation on the range of issues raised by separation.
And so that I'm not, because I don't claim to have any expertise in what happens when companies separate, but the actual separation had taken place a year before, had it not?
In terms of corporate separation, I'm not quite sure when corporately the two companies separated. I think you may be right, and then obviously operationally it was an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying that the act which enabled the separation yes. was January 2012, and the actual separation was April 2012.
Yes, I think you're
And
correct.
So this is a process, in effect, to sell shares in Royal Mail.
Correct, yes.
Right, okay, thank you.
I'm going to go back slightly in time to poll 00112856 to the 9th of September. This is the insurance notification that the inquiry has seen. If we scroll over the page, we can see that it was communicated via a note on Bond Dickinson headed paper. And if we scroll down and over the page to page 3, we can see the section there on risk to the post office. And we've dealt with other witnesses on how this came to be formulated. Were you involved in this at all?
No.
Were you aware of concerns about the provision of information to the post office's insurers around this time?
I was aware that I think at the July board, questions had been raised by some of the board directors about the insurance position. I think that's referenced in the 26th of July paper, which we looked at earlier. So I was aware of it to that extent, and obviously we're aware of what was covered in that paper. I wasn't close to what happened to that discussion after the 26th of July.
You say in relation to the prospectus that you were aware of a general concern around and sensitivity to the overall issues in the business. Were you aware of those concerns and sensitivities when it came to the type of information that was provided to post offices insurers?
No, I really wasn't close to that process at all. It was being led by, I think, our CFO at the time.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 003820001 in the bottom of the page, please? This is the email that the inquiry's seen several times. It's at the bottom of the page. It's from Paula Venables to Alice Perkins. Hi Alice, don't worry about the lateness of this note. I'm clearing the tray before signing out. And then it's the bottom of this page. It says, my concern, re Sparrow, currently is our obligations of disclosure regarding an unsafe witness. The representative from Fujitsu made statements about no bugs, which later it could be seen to have been undermined by the second site report. We do not think it material, but it could be high profile. Martin E. is briefed if you want more detail. Who had you been briefed by?
As far as I recollect, it was by Paula herself.
And what did she say?
So my recollection's hazy. It was a verbal conversation. I think she had been updated by the legal team. I assume Susan, but I can only remember similar details to what she covers in this email, that there was a concern that the Fujitsu witness hadn't disclosed the bugs which became apparent, which were disclosed to the second site report. That would most likely need to be disclosed to previous prosecutions. As I understood it, that was part that had been put into the Cartwright-King review process. My recollection, the general impression I got from that conversation kind of accords with what we've got here, which it was sensitive, it clearly wasn't helpful, but it wasn't viewed to be material to the outcome of those prosecutions. That was the general, that's the best of my recollection.
So we do not think it material. Is that yourself and Ms. Fennells?
No, certainly not my opinion. I think my impression, my recollection is that was the opinion which Paul had formed having discussed this with the legal team. And just for, I think the reason I was brought into the loop at this point, this is the inquiry is probably aware, this is a period when Susan Crichton was in the process of leaving the business. As I recall, Paul had brought me into the loop. She wanted to let Alice know, but she also wanted to give Alice a point of contact she could reach to whilst Paula was away. And for obvious reasons, Susan probably wasn't the appropriate point of contact, so she brought me into the loop so Alice could reach out to me if she wanted further information.
So your briefing there was only from Paula Fennells?
I can't recall being briefed on this directly by the legal team. I can't recall anything verbally. I haven't seen anything in the documentation.
Had you seen the review by Brian Altman?
No. I'd seen it being referred to and brief bits of it summarised, but no, I hadn't seen the review itself.
Summarised by who?
I think Roderick Williams. It may have been, it was around this time, particularly as part of the drafting of the CEO's report. Roderick sent me some contributions to that and included brief summaries of what Brighton Altman was concluding.
So Mr. Altman's review is dated the 15th of October. Perhaps you can very briefly go to that. That's poll 406803. If we turn to page 18, if we scroll down, he addresses the issue of Gareth Jenkins. He then addresses the issue over the page of the Helen Rose report. It says at paragraph 50, the draft report is based on an exchange between Gareth Jenkins and Helen Rose. If we perhaps move on to page 44. Mr. Altman had addressed Gareth Jenkins and the impact on possible appeals. Perhaps we could turn to paragraph 142. He said, of grave concern is that Mr. Jenkins informed the second site inquiry of the two defects, which they reported at section 6 of the report, suggesting that he knew of them in the period Mr. Clark argues in his 15th of July 2013 advice to be between 5th of October 2012 and 3rd of April 2013, which are the dates of essentially 5 Jenkins witness statements Mr. Clark sampled. Yet in none of them is there to be found any reference to these 2 system defects. On the contrary, his reports speak to the general integrity of the system. Had this kind of information been brought to your attention?
No, not in this level of detail or candour. The only bit which resonates is which resonates from the conversation I had with Paula was around the number of past cases which might be impacted. So the figure of 5 sounds familiar, but none of this detail I'd seen before.
So you think around this time you were aware that around 5 cases had been impacted by what the provision of evidence by Mr. Jenkins?
What I recall in Paula's description of what impacts the Gareth Jenkins issue might have, I recognise a figure of 5 being described to her as one of the reasons why she or the legal team didn't view this to be highly material.
Because of the small number of people that it directly
I think
involved.
A combination of the small number of people and I guess the impression I was given is that it was clearly deeply unhelpful and deeply inappropriate, but didn't necessarily add to the disclosure of the 2 bugs themselves, which had been disclosed to past prosecutions through the second site reports. It wasn't conveyed to me that it added very much to that.
Conveyed to you by who?
As I say, I'm basing this on the verbal briefing I was given by Paula.
So Paula Reynolds had sent an email to Alice Perkins. She was about to go away. You were the person who had been briefed on the issue. Do you think that you were sufficiently briefed?
No, and I think in practice what she was expecting me to do, she wanted to give Alice the name of someone she could contact in her absence. Susan Crichton, I think, if hadn't formally left the business, was effectively left. I think, from memory, Chris Ojada had only just started, so it wasn't really appropriate to give his name. I don't think Alice would have known the names of the people who sat below Susan, so she was giving Alice my name to reach out to, and I would then liaise with the likes of Roderick Williams if further information was needed.
If we scroll down, we can see more further sections addressing the Gareth Jenkins issue. And something we're going to come to in a moment. If we turn to page 54, paragraph 173, Mr. Ortman has said the Helen Rose report adds very little, it seems to me, other than to point to a particular issue at Lepton and the implications from the report that as early as 2013, Gareth Jenkins was aware of integrity issues with Horizon, none of which he revealed. The second site report and the Rose report are the limit of the current disclosure regime. I'm aware of anyone being provided with anything more than this. Could we please turn to poll 004076608? Now, this is going slightly back in time, nearly 2 months before that email from Paula Reynolds to Alice Perkins. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can see an email from Susan Crichton. And she says, Paula, further to our conversation this afternoon, this is the 3rd of September, there are 2 issues that we need to obtain JA's view on our approach. And that must be James Arbuthnot. If we keep on scrolling, there's a section in that email entitled Legal and Adjudication of Future Cases. And it's the bullet points below that that I would like to draw to your attention. Meeting was held with our external law firm who have been completing the criminal case review. The issues that we want Brian Ortman QC to advise on were agreed, final sign-off of review process, options re-appointment of independent expert witness, paper to follow, advice on prosecutions going forward. Following this discussion, terms of reference for his review to be finalised. It's the reference there to the appointment of independent expert witness. were you aware at that time, September 2013, that there was an issue with the expert witness?
I'm not sure I was. The clearest first recollection I've got of it was in October in relation to the exchange we've been just discussing. I don't recall picking up on this point or particularly understanding it. I certainly don't think I'd link this to what I now understand to be the Gareth Jenkins issue.
Because if we scroll up, we can see that Paula Venables has sent this email to you. If we scroll up slightly, can you see there? But that's not something that sunk in at all about a concern regarding an expert witness or the appointment of a new expert witness?
It's not something which I certainly didn't pick up on that. I think the main reason I was being copied in at that point, I think I was supporting on some of the preparations for the appointment of the chair of the working group, obviously what ultimately became Sir Anthony Hooper. So I think that's why Paula Venables added me to the copy list. I certainly don't recall reading this email and picking up on that specific bullet point.
But by the time of that Paula Venables email to Alice Perkins saying that you had been briefed, you were aware of that concern?
Yes.
I said I'd move on to the issue of the Helen Rose report, and I'm going to do that now. Could we please turn to poll 001967707? And if we could start on page 5, please. Thank you. There's an email here from yourself to Roderick Williams, and the subject is CEO's report text on criminal cases review. So this was going to be a report from Paula Venables. Is that to the board?
Yes, this was part of, as part of each board meeting, there'll be what's known as the CEO's report, which was a 4 or 5 page summary of issues going on across the business. Part of my job was to collate the production of that report.
And you say, hi, Roderick, as discussed, here's the text. Grateful if you could amend as appropriate. And the text as drafted at that point was as follows. Our criminal barrister, Brian Altman, has now completed his review of the approach we are taking to reviewing cases that have been subject to prosecution, in particular looking at whether complying with our duty of disclosure, the findings of Second Sight, whether we are complying with our duty of disclosure, duty to disclose the findings of the Second Sight report to the defence team in cases where it's appropriate to do so. Just pausing there, had you, by this stage, read Mr. Altman's report?
No, I don't believe I ever received the Brian Altman report. The first time I saw the actual report was when it was disclosed to me a few weeks back.
You say his conclusion is that our approach is fundamentally sound, in quotation marks, providing us with strong grounds to resist any formal review of our historic prosecutions, for example, by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. To date, following several sifts, our external firm of solicitors has identified 11 cases where disclosure is required. It is now a matter for the defence in those particular cases to determine what action, if any, they might take in light of this additional information. How did you draft that if you hadn't read Mr. Altman's report?
So this drafting was based on, I think there was a first draft produced by Andy Holt, who was then the programme manager for what was now known as the Sparrow process. I'd raised some questions on that. I think that had then been farmed out to Andy Parsons, who provided some input. So in short, this text was a synthesis of what had been given from the team. So this is basically their substance, which I then edited down into a short paragraph.
Could we scroll up, please? Mr. Williams responds. He says, I've highlighted my amendments in bold below. Please note, and there are 2 points, I've left in fundamentally sound, as Brian uses it in his report. But then he says, Brian's view on the CCRC is that we have responded to the Criminal Cases Review Commission appropriately, but should the Commission continue to show interest in these cases, there might have to come a time when Post Office Limited considers sharing Cartwright King Review's findings with the Commission and cooperating with the Commission. So Mr. Williams is highlighting there that the section on the Criminal Cases Review Commission needs to be a little bit more nuanced, because it might be that the Post Office do have to, in due course, cooperate with them.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, to explain, part of the CEO's report itself tended to be very concise, but it was accompanied by the Chief Executive would then deliver it in the board alongside a verbal briefing. So part of the process of this was, alongside the report itself, giving Paula background notes so she could voice over of more detail. So this might be the type of thing which fed into her background briefing.
And but this was the actual wording that went directly to the board. I mean, not this particular wording, will come to the wording, but the ultimate CEO report text would go to the board.
Yes.
He has added in after Second Sight regarding disclosure of the Helen Rose report, and he has amended the wording regarding the Criminal Cases Review Commission to say that Mr. Altman's review has enabled us to assert to the Criminal Cases Review Commission that insofar as our historic prosecutions are concerned, we responded to the Second Sight report in a prudent and responsible manner. So it's watered down in light of that caveat from Mr. Altman, it seems.
Yes.
If we scroll up, we can see your response. You say, "Hi, Roderick, thanks for this. Is the Helen Rose report a key part of the disclosure? If so, I think we'll need to include a reference to it in square brackets below, but we'll also need a sentence to explain what it is, as Paula and the board won't have heard of it. Please, could you suggest some wording?" If we scroll up, we can see Mr. Williams's response. He says, "Cartwright King advised that the Helen Rose report meets the test for disclosure, i.e. it might undermine the prosecution's case or assist the accused, and is therefore being disclosed where appropriate. I've added a very high-level sentence to address this, again in bold. I have quite a bit of further information on the Helen Rose report, so can go into it in more detail if required. Please let me know if you think you would like me to do so, or if you want to see any of the underlying documents, e.g. the report itself, or Cartwright King or Brian Altman's advice on it." And he's there inserted a summary of the Helen Rose report. It says the Helen Rose report was prepared in June 2013 by a member of the Post Office security team and refers to emails with Fujitsu from January and February 2013, suggestive of there being issues with Horizon, training and support. It's worded slightly strangely there at the end, isn't it, with the comma. It was your reading of that it was suggestive of there being issues with Horizon and issues with training and support, or that it identified issues with Horizon training and support?
I think, candidly, I wasn't sure, and this wording begged lots of questions to me, and it felt like we were getting into territory which needed much more explanation. Well, you're probably going to come on to it.
Because
to be honest, I wasn't. This raised more questions to me than it answered. I don't think it particularly helped explain the full implications of the Helen Rose report.
But not just questions, but also presumably concerns, because there appears to be a report which is suggestive of there being issues with Horizon.
Yes, yeah, it was. Yes, absolutely. And it was the first I'd heard of this, and I was pretty sure it wasn't something which had been briefed to Paula or the board at that point.
And if we look above, you say, "Thanks very much, Roderick. Unfortunately, I think I probably do need to give Paula more information on this, as this is going to raise all sorts of questions from her and the board. Please could you send me the report and any associated advice, etc." If we scroll up, he said, "I thought as much. Can I suggest we take 10 to 15 minutes tomorrow morning to go over what we have and where it goes to help me tailor the response?" And then above, you say, "Yes, agree to a quick catch-up tomorrow. As you'll see from the text I've just re-articulated, I've decided it's probably better not to mention the Helen Rose report specifically, as it will only serve to confuse things with the board, although I will still need to give Paula background notes on the issue. I've also cut back the text on the review of past cases. Hope this still works. Now, having seen reference to there being issues with Horizon, rather than removing reference to that report, wouldn't you want to find out quite a lot more about it at that stage?
Yes, and I think, as we'll hopefully come on to, part of the follow-up actions was to arrange a proper briefing from the team to pull on these issues. I think my concern at this point, and this is another late-night email, I think I was concerned that this potentially, I didn't know what to make of this reference to Helen Rose report. All I did know was it was new news, and Roderick's explanation in the preceding text, as I say, raised more questions than it answered. Candidly, I was quite concerned about putting information into a report going out in Paula's name when she wasn't familiar with this issue. It felt inappropriate to put something in a report in her name before she'd been properly briefed. So I took the judgment call late at night to take it out and instead arrange for a briefing for her, and then she could decide what to do with that information. So it was a kind of judgment late at night based on limited information. I think that the key thing which we'll come on to is I then arranged a briefing, the team to give Paula a briefing on the topics so she could take a view.
And were you present at the briefing?
No, I was just about to go on leave, so I commissioned Belinda Crowe to coordinate that briefing and give it to Paula.
Yes. We'll come and look at that document. But before we do, can we please turn to the first page? Roderick Williams has responded to you the next morning. Thanks, Martin. I'll comment separately on your revised text, which read well, as amended by Andy Holt. I attach a briefing note from Cartwright King addressing the issues we discussed yesterday, namely 1, update to the criminal case reviews to date, 2, a summary of the appeal steps a defendant can take in those few cases where further disclosure has been made, and then 3, whether the Helen Rose report is in the public domain. It's not. Copy attached along with covering letter. I think it's sensible to keep references to the Helen Rose report at a minimum, as it may not be a live issue going forward. You will see from the final paragraph of the briefing note that it is unlikely to require disclosure in any further cases and will not be disclosed in any pending or future prosecution. Brian Altman QC was also of the view that it added very little. And we can see the attachments that Mr. Williams sent alongside that email. The first is the Helen Rose report. Could we turn to poll 00196-708? The documents I'm taking you to are known as a family document, so we are sure that those are the actual attachments to this email. Though other versions exist. But if we look at this document, this is the Helen Rose report, but it is the redacted version of the Helen Rose report. And if we scroll down over the page, we can see this is the one where, in fact, Gareth Jenkins' name has been redacted. But what we do see, though, on page 3, about 3/4 of the way down, is the part of the Helen Rose report where it says, I know you are aware of all the Horizon integrity issues. Did you read this at the time?
I think I may have skim-read it. I'm not sure I would have known what to make of it. It's obviously a relatively operational and technical report. I think I skim-read it and I didn't come away from it thinking, oh, I see what the key issue is here.
So we had Mr. Williams suggest the form of words in that briefing to the board that said, suggestive of there being issues with Horizon. That particular paragraph suggests perhaps that there are issues with Horizon. But that wasn't something that you thought of at the time.
I'm not sure if... this particular paragraph doesn't jump out clearly wrongly in hindsight, I probably put more weight on some of the text in Roderick's covering email where he quotes Brian Altman and generally gives quite a lot of reassurance that it isn't a material issue and doesn't add very much. So I think at that point in time I was probably reassured that actually maybe this isn't such a material part of the disclosure. But I mean, what I would emphasise is I did still arrange for the team to give a briefing to Paula to follow up on it properly.
And if we look at the second attachment, that's Pol 001967009. This is the briefing note that was produced by Cartwright King that's referred to in Mr. Williams's email. If we scroll over the page, please, we can see there's reference. One of the purposes of this was to provide a short explanation of the status of the Helen Rose report. And if we look at paragraph 4 on that page, we see there it says the Helen Rose report is not in the public domain and should not be placed in the public domain. Nevertheless, is subject to the disclosure rules. As a matter of law, a defendant to whom any material is disclosed is constrained from using the material. If we scroll down, it says there, because this report goes only to the apparent knowledge of Gareth Jenkins at the time of his writing of his expert court reports, its status as a disclosable document ends where he no longer provides such reports. Accordingly, it's unlikely to require disclosure in any further cases and will not be disclosed in any pending or future prosecution. There is also another attachment to that email. It's Pol 001967010. And that's an example covering letter that was sent out regarding disclosure. It's the second paragraph that refers to the second site report and the Helen Rose report. I'd like to take you to the final report to the board. That's Pol 001967006. So this is the ultimate briefing that was produced. Presumably finalised after you had received those documents.
Yes.
If we have a look at the third bullet point, it's dated the 24th of October. Our external firm of criminal solicitors, Cartwright King, has now completed a review of 301 cases, subject to past prosecution, to identify whether we have a duty to disclose the findings of the second site report and associated issues. So now the Helen Rose report is now referred to as associated issues. Is that right?
Yes.
Cartwright King has concluded that disclosure is appropriate in 10 of these cases, and a short letter has therefore been sent to each of the defence teams to bring their attention to the report. It is now a matter for the defence in each case to determine what action, if any, they might take in light of this additional information. We are also awaiting an unknown number of further historical prosecution files from Royal Mail, although at this stage we have no reason to believe these will subsequently increase the number of actual disclosures. In view of the potential interest from the Criminal Cases Review Commission, we have also asked our criminal barrister, Brian Altman QC, to conduct an independent review of the overall process we have taken to review past cases, reaching the conclusion that our approach is fundamentally sound. So that was the ultimate summary of the passage that we have been looking at. I mean, perhaps we could bring it up onto screen alongside Pol 001967007. Page 4 of that document, if that's possible. Thank you. So if we scroll down slightly on the left-hand side, we can see it was that second passage that I took you to earlier, the slightly more nuanced approach to references to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And it seems as though that, to some extent, has been lost in the final briefing. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it's clearly gone through further editing. Yes, I'd agree with that.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 00196-705? And this is the reference to the briefing that you have mentioned. It's the 28th of October, 2013. One of those attachments is the email chain that we've been looking at with those various attachments. And you say as follows: "Hi, Belinda. Here's the final text on Sparrow." So that's the final text that I just took you to. That's the separate attachment, which went into the CEO's report. As discussed earlier, very grateful if you could coordinate the briefing, which Paula will need ahead of the board, to bring her up to speed on the issues and prepare her for any difficult questions from the non-executive directors. It now looks highly likely that Paula won't be able to attend tomorrow's steering group. If we can fit in a separate short catch-up for you, Chris and her, we will, but this might not be possible. And then there are various bullet points. One is update on any mediation/working group process, including feedback from Tony Hooper's first meeting of the working group. Linked to this, an explanation of Second Sight's expected role going forwards, bearing in mind that certain board members will have such strong expectation that they should be out of the process by the end of December, so we may have to manage these expectations. This is a separate issue, but it's something we discussed earlier about moves to limit or end Second Sight's involvement. Then any additional detail on the settlement policy, which we're in the process of developing, and it's this, I think, final bullet point here, any explanation of the issues around the review of past criminal cases, which Roderick can help provide, covering A, what exactly has been disclosed so far, and B, our best guess of the implications of these disclosures, i.e. explaining that at this stage we have no reason to believe that this means past cases will be found to be unsafe. Just pausing there, how had you formed that view?
I think that had been informed by the emails we'd seen earlier from Roderick and others, including some fairly reassuring quotations from the Brian Altman reports.
I've attached an email from Roderick which contains some of the answers to these questions, but would be useful to have this together in one place. And then if we look at the bottom of that email, it says, the board is on Thursday, so it would be useful for her to have this by tomorrow evening or Wednesday morning. As you know, I'm on leave after today. I may have an opportunity to log in the evenings to look at things, but if not, then I suggest you send directly to Paula, copied to me. So the work that you had been carrying out in the previous days on the CEO's report to the board and the information that you had gathered from Roderick Williams has now just been handed over to Belinda Crowe to summarise for Paula Venables. Is that right?
Yes, essentially.
Did you keep tabs on what form the briefing ultimately took?
I don't believe I did. I think I followed it up. By the time I returned, the board meeting had already happened, so the moment had passed. But I remember seeing confirmation that a briefing had been sent.
But you don't recall reading the briefing?
No, by then I was on leave.
We saw those discussions about the Helen Rose report and its implications, and your view was to leave it out of the board, the paper that went to the board, but I think you had confidence that it would be raised by Ms Venables at the board. Did you take any steps to make sure that there was a proper briefing in that respect?
I think I relied on, I clearly here have passed the baton to Belinda to coordinate with input from Roderick. I relied on that process and that input to Paula to get to the right answer.
What was Belinda Crowe's role?
I think by now she had just taken over as programme manager for what was then called the Sparrow process, so coordinating all of these work streams.
I think you said that you didn't have a good knowledge or any knowledge of the contents of the Helen Rose report before you had seen it, or even the Brian Altman report up until very recently. Were you aware of her state of knowledge of the underlying issues when you sent this email?
I was aware she was also new to these topics and would be heavily reliant on input from Roderick to get to the right information. I think Roderick was copied into this email.
Thank you. Can we please turn to poll 3029707? This is a much later email, and I don't think you're involved in this correspondence, but it's a document that I took Mr. Parsons to, where he talks about the Helen Rose report. And if we scroll down to the penultimate paragraph, he says as follows. He says, putting this issue aside, the real and confidential reason that the report was disclosed was because Helen's comment at the bottom of page 3 suggests that it was widely known that there were problems with Horizon. This statement, regardless of whether it is correct, could have been used to attack Gareth Jenkins's credibility as the Post Office's Horizon expert, as he had previously stated that there were no problems with Horizon. Is that something that you were aware of?
No. This very clear explanation of the implication of the Helen Rose report wasn't apparent to me until this document was disclosed to me, and I've followed some of the other evidence. So, candidly, the penny only dropped very recently on exactly why the Helen Rose report was significant. That wasn't apparent to me in this very clear way at the time.
Thank you. I have two very brief topics to address before I hand over to others. The first is Shecs and your involvement and relationship with them. Could we please turn to UKGI 401852? I think you said that you were the main liaison when it came to non-communications matters. Is that right?
I think, I provided an informal channel of communication. If they needed to pick up the phone to someone, I was a point of contact they could use, yes.
If we look at the bottom of page 2, we see correspondence between Mr. Batten and Roderick Williams, and you're copied into this email. This is an email that we saw with Jo Swinson because she was going to be making an announcement to Parliament and they were seeking information about numbers of convictions. And if we look up above, there's a series of questions that have been posed by Mr. Gibson of the Shareholder Executive. If we go to the first page, at the bottom of the page, Susan Crichton has said on to it, so they're on to finding out the questions, and also we're working on this. And then if we scroll up slightly, Mr. Batten said, and this is July, 16th of July, so a week later, did Susan, Roderick or Martin ever come back to either of you on this? I know the Post Office often dropped me off their copy list, so I tried not to take it personally. And then above, we have Mr. Whitehead saying, sadly, they have a habit of dropping everybody off when we seek awkward data. I've not seen anything, and my guess is, without a chaser, they'll unilaterally decide we don't need it. Was that typical of your relationship with UKGI?
I don't think... What I think it probably does reflect is a bit of mutual frustration on the way information was requested and shared between the business and UKGI. And there were two perspectives on that. Clearly what we see here is a frustration from the Shecs team not getting the information they need. On the other side, the frustration from the business is requests appear to come in quite in an unstructured way at short notice, and there are frustrations on both sides, and it clearly wasn't always working very well. I think over time we moved on to a more structured basis to the benefit of both sides, but I think this does absolutely reflect a bit of a kind of teething problems on the early relationship between the business and the shareholder post-separation.
Could we please turn to poll 003733845? And this relates to Mr. Callard becoming a new non-executive director of the Post Office. So we're moving on now to February 2014. If we look at the bottom email, Ms. Venables sends an email to a group, and if we look slightly below that, just the top of the next page, she says Richard Scope has not yet picked up Sparrow or business transformation. It will, as he's attending next week's board meeting. But as this is the case, I suggest that we leave them off the Shecs review agenda, as he will be well briefed by then. And if we scroll up, please, to your response. You say as follows, on a separate but related topic, it just struck me this evening, belatedly, that I, Alwyn or Chris D, or a combination of all three, need to get into the discipline of reading the draft board papers with a specific focus on checking for Shecs sensitivities now that Mr. Callard will be receiving them. There are numerous small points that we'll need to watch out for. I'll read through the ones I haven't checked in the morning, kids permitting. Can you assist us? Why would you need to read draft papers with a specific focus on checking for Shecs sensitivities?
So I think this would have been a general point. It was recognising whilst it was quite right that we moved to a position of Shecs having a representative on the board, that was new for the business. And there were sometimes tensions and conflicts of interest, particularly part of our relationship between Shecs and the board. Shecs was our funder. So, for example, we might be putting papers to the business which are relevant to our funding position. Previously, the business could have drafted papers without worrying about Shecs seeing that paper. So clearly there were, I think there were the potential for sensitivities across the piece, as I say, numerous small sensitivities. It just felt like good discipline to make sure there is a kind of filter on the papers. We are reviewing the papers for any watch-outs.
NB, on your point below about Sparrow, Belinda and I met Mr. Callard yesterday afternoon, so he's now fully up to speed and understands why this was high on your list of things which keep you awake at night. What did you mean there?
I think really just it was clearly it was a major issue for the business and a major issue for the chief executive, and Richard Callard was now briefed on that.
He now has a good understanding of the handling issues around Second Sight and the scenarios in which we may need further support/cover from ministers. Was that about removing Second Sight's involvement or limiting their involvement?
I think that may well have been, that's probably what it was referring to. I think by then there'd been some ongoing debates with the business about Second Sight's role. So yes, that's highly likely to be that what I was referring to.
Thank you. That can come down. We've spoken today about one particular role you had. How do you consider that role as Chief of Staff prepared you for your subsequent roles at the Post Office?
Well, it clearly gave me a broad insight across the business. A lot of my time of Chief of Staff was actually more spent on the strategy and funding side, and that was kind of very squarely what I then worked on in the next job.
Is that as Group Strategy Director?
Yes. And I mean, more generally, this whole experience has, I think, given me lots of lessons for subsequent roles in the Post Office.
Yeah. Have you taken part in any lessons learned exercises?
I mean, I think it's fair to say the whole business has been going through a lessons learned process over the past few years. I think it's kind of built into the business now.
And for you personally, what have you particularly identified as your own lessons to be learned from the role that you played?
So I think there's a number. I think the first one, it's very apparent in hindsight that the business was caught up in groupthink and I was part of that, and at no point do I see myself properly stepping outside that and challenging it. And I deeply regret that, and I think that's been a hugely important lesson to me. I think a second lesson which links to that At that point in my career, I would have taken advice from legal experts or IT experts at face value. I'm now far more aware that advice from experts needs to be properly challenged and scrutinised. Everyone has biases, and the advice they need to provide, and that needs appropriate scrutiny. And I think the third lesson is the importance, particularly for the roles which I do, which tend to be working on at the centre of the business on high-level strategy, is balancing that with an understanding of individual perspectives.
Thank you. So it's now time for some questions from call participants. Are you happy for us to proceed with Mr. Henry and then perhaps take a short break? We have a very small number of questions from Mr. Jacobs, Mr. Maloney, and Mr. Watt, which shouldn't be too long. I think Mr. Henry has the larger number of questions.
Well, I'll do whatever suits the transcriber best on this occasion. So we've been going for...
an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to necessarily circumscribe Mr. Henry, but if he's going to be 10 minutes, we'll do as you say. If he's going to be 20 minutes, I think it's probably appropriate to have a break.
I think the shorthand writer would like a break.
Yes. So perhaps we could take a 10-minute break now.
Fine. All right.
Thank you, sir. We have Mr. Henry, followed by Ms. Watt, followed by Mr. Maloney.
Fine.
Thank you.
Mr. Edwards, you were part of an executive team that used all its guile and skill to suppress the reputational and financial risk of historic prosecutions being reopened, weren't you?
I think I was clearly part of an executive team which didn't do enough to put this right at that stage.
You did precisely the opposite of furthering the right. You were actually involved in suppressing the matter, weren't you?
I'm not sure I'd agree with that.
You were even complicit in a cover-up concerning the unsafe witness, were you not?
I certainly wasn't, no.
Now, you do not mention the issue of the unsafe witness at any stage in your witness statement of the 18th of April 2024, nor in that witness statement do you mention any conversation you had with Paula Venables in respect of that issue of the unsafe witness. You accept that?
Yes, it's not in my witness statement.
Yet when Mr. Blake asked you about this very significant conversation, you offered an account that the unsafe witness, so you were told by Miss Venables, was implicated in 5 cases. Is that correct?
I recollected that being a small number, yes.
And you recalled that from as long ago as 2013, but you did not mention it once in your witness statement. You were holding it back, weren't you?
I focused my witness statements on the questions posed to me as part of my Rule 9 request there. There was nothing on this specific topic.
But it was a very significant matter, and you did not volunteer it, did you?
Candidly, I did not. I certainly didn't appreciate the significance of this matter at the time. I didn't appreciate it when I constructed my witness statements. Everything I've heard since then, I do now understand its importance, but it was certainly not a deliberate withholding of that.
You are telling the inquiry, Chairman, that you did not appreciate its significance at the time. You obviously appreciated its significance at the time when you were told it, correct?
In the terms I described earlier.
You know the purpose of this inquiry. It's a highly material issue, an issue of extraordinary importance. I suggest that you were hoping it would not be discovered.
No, that's not the case.
You knew that the inquiry was not aware of the issue at the time and hadn't unearthed the email from Paula Venables to Alice Perkins, but you were aware of the issue, Mr. Edwards, and you didn't volunteer it. That's the truth, isn't it?
No, it's not. That's not the case. I didn't recollect that email. I didn't particularly have a strong recollection of this issue. My appreciation of the significance of this issue has been very recent. I certainly did not appreciate the significance of this issue at the time.
I suggest that that cannot be right. At the very least, from what you knew at the time, back in 2013, was the risk that 5 people may have been convicted on the back of evidence from an unsafe witness. That surely would have been obvious to you.
As I described, the account I was given of this was it was clearly important. My understanding at the time that that was going to be disclosed to the past prosecutions, but I was not led to believe at the time that it was highly material on top of other information which had been disclosed. I completely did not appreciate the significance of this at the time.
So when you say that your understanding at the time was that it was going to be disclosed to the past prosecutions, was that something that just floated into your head, or were you told that by Paula Venables?
That was my understanding.
Where did you get the understanding from?
That was the nature of the conversation. And indeed, I think in the email we looked at from Ms. Venables to Paula, it talks about the disclosure of this information.
No, on the contrary, that email reads, and there's no need to get it up on the screen, "My concern re Sparrow currently is our obligations of disclosure re an unsafe witness. The representative from Fujitsu made statements about no bugs, which later could be seen to have been undermined by the Second Sight report. We do not think it material, but it could be high profile. Martin E. is briefed if you want more detail. This is just in case." Do you want to reflect on the answer you've just given?
I think what that email refers to, it talks about obligations redisclosure. As I said, my recollection of this conversation is hazy, but as I understood it, Cartwright King, as our external lawyers, were reviewing the disclosure of this information to the past cases. And as Paula goes on to describe, it wasn't viewed to be material. That is consistent with my recollection and understanding at the time.
Well, I'll come back to that. I want to go quickly to your statement. No need to get it up on the screen. I'll read it verbatim. Paragraph 13. "I believe I first became aware of concerns raised about bugs, errors or defects with Horizon due to the campaigning work of Alan Bates and the Justice for Sub-Postmaster Alliance. On the 4th of October 2012, a couple of weeks after I joined the Post Office, I attended a meeting with Paula Venables, James Arbuthnot and Alan Bates of the JFSA in relation to the Second Sight investigation. I attended the meeting in a note-taking capacity only. During the meeting, alleged Horizon errors were raised by Alan Bates. And I don't need to take you to the document, but your notes of that meeting are recorded at POL 00295-635, notes which are dated the 5th of October 2012, and amongst those notes, meeting with JA and AB, Paula said it was absolutely essential that the judicial process was flawless and therefore would consider this point, which had been raised by Sir Alan Bates, in detail, and that was about unfairness to sub-postmasters. If it is absolutely essential, Mr. Edwards, that the judicial process is flawless, would you agree that that would mandate disclosing to the defence any wrongdoing by an expert who had secured a conviction for the Post Office against a hapless defendant?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
You were told, you claim by Miss Venables, that the unsafe witness concerned 5 cases. 5, 50 or 1 case, an unsafe witness had given evidence against sub-postmasters and people had been convicted, hadn't they? You knew that?
Yes.
Right. Now, you were the Chief Executive Officer's Chief of Staff, and yet you claim you hadn't read the Altman General Review of the 15th of October 2013 before drafting her report to the board.
I hadn't been given that document.
You stand by that?
Yes.
You're admitting negligence, aren't you? It would be negligent to draft a Chief Executive Officer's report to the board on a very serious matter without having read the Altman General Review.
In the role I was performing, so in that Chief Executive's report, I'd be covering maybe a dozen major topics on the business. I was heavily dependent, completely dependent on the input from subject matter experts. I didn't have the capacity to read every document and do everything they were doing. But I think in the hindsight, I'd agree there was not enough scrutiny by the executive team of, as we've heard, there wasn't enough sharing of legal advice. I didn't see that at the time.
But this is totally contrary to your role. A top, politically astute and well-connected Queen's Counsel has been appointed to do a general review, and yet are you telling the chairman that nobody in the executive team read the general review by Brian Altman QC?
I can only comment on, I didn't see it.
It's totally contrary to your role, because when you were suggesting at an early stage in your evidence, but I think you've resiled from it, that you were a mere conduit, nevertheless, you were digesting and appraising material that was directed to the CEO so you could apprise her of the contents. You must have read the Altman General Review.
I did not read the Altman General Review. I did not see it.
Right. Well, we see in the email that I have quoted already that Paula Venables used the term material when she was writing her email to Alice Perkins. In the Altman General Review, the term material is mentioned 35 times. Were you familiar with the term material?
Not specifically, no.
And yet, according to your boss, Martin E. is briefed if you want more detail, and I emphasize more detail. This is just in case. Are you telling the truth, Mr. Edwards?
Absolutely. I gave my evidence on that earlier. I was given as a point of contact for Alice. If she needed more detail in practice, I'd clearly be reliant on the legal team to provide that.
And so you were again, although you were briefed on the issue, again, you're merely saying that you're just, as it were, a conduit, that she'll contact you and then you'll put her in touch with who? Roderick Williams, Hugh Flemington, etc., etc.
Yes, I think it would have been more appropriate for her to be in contact with the General Counsel, but as you're aware, at that point in time, one General Counsel was leaving and another one was just about to join. So I was there as a point of contact for Alice. But yes, I would have been reliant on getting answers to the questions from the legal team.
Now, you knew why General Counsel was leaving, presumably, because you were the Chief of Staff to Paula Venables. What had she told you about the departure of Susan Crichton?
I was aware there'd been tensions between Susan and Alice and the broader board. I wasn't party to all of the detail which the inquiry has now seen.
Did Paula Venables say that Susan Crichton's loyalties were misplaced and that she was ascribing too much loyalty to her professional obligations?
No, that wouldn't be the type of conversation she'd have with me.
And yet you were her chief of staff?
Yes.
I want to go now to POL 003 72558. And I want to inquire with you about why you took certain decisions in respect of this exchange between you and Roderick Williams. And again, it's in the context of the report of the CEO to the board. And just dealing with that, as you'll see from the text I've just re-articulated, I've decided it's probably better not to mention the Helen Rose report specifically, as it will only serve to confuse things with the board, although I will still need to give Paula background notes on the issue. How are you going to do that if you hadn't read Altman?
Well, as we covered earlier, the practical step I took was to arrange for the team to give Paula a briefing on this.
I will still need to give Paula background notes on the issue, not I will get Flemington, Williams, God forbid, Singh to give background notes on the issue. I will still need to give Paula background notes on the issue. How are you going to do that if you hadn't read Altman?
When I say I will need to give Paula background notes, that doesn't mean I will need to be responsible for drafting them. My role was to make sure Paula had the briefing she needed. In doing that, I was heavily dependent on subject matter experts to provide that, and I therefore arranged for that to be provided.
I suggest that the Helen Rose report, and we can deal with this very quickly, would reveal that Gareth Jenkins had a credibility problem, that he'd not been frank about bugs, errors and defects, and Mr. Blake took you to paragraph 173 of the Altman General Review, which says just that. You were making sure the board were not told about a document which might have brought up the potentially high-profile issue of the unsafe witness. Isn't that right?
No, absolutely not.
And if, as that report, the Helen Rose report suggested, it was widely known that there were problems with Horizon, that could have been used to attack Gareth Jenkins' credibility. You can't deny that, can you?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
It's not a coincidence that you decided it's probably better not to mention the Helen Rose report, because the Helen Rose report was welded together with the issue of Gareth Jenkins' credibility. You knew that.
No, I didn't, and I think it's evident from my email exchange with Roderick that I'm none the wiser on the significance of the Helen Rose report. I absolutely didn't understand its significance. And as I described earlier, I didn't understand its significance until extremely recently, and I've seen other disclosures which spell it out very clearly. I did not have that awareness at the time.
You're presenting yourself as some naif, and yet you're the chief of staff to the CEO. I suggest that your response there is dissembling.
No, it's not. It's become apparent to me there were a number of topics which, candidly, I was naive about, so I didn't understand the full details. The nature of the Chief of Staff role, I was spread across dozens of major topics across the business. It simply wasn't possible to understand the detail of every one. But yes, candidly, I was naive on some of these topics.
Let me go to page 4 of that document, please. This was your first stab at a précis, and I want to go through it very, very quickly. Our criminal barrister, Brian Altman, has now completed his review, etc., etc., etc. Our approach is fundamentally sound, providing us with strong grounds to resist any formal review of our historic prosecutions, for example, by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Who had suggested that the Altman Review would justify stonewalling the Criminal Cases Review Commission?
I think, as I described earlier, this text was the synthesis of some contributions from Andy Holt, which I then asked some questions on, and I think it was then farmed out to Andy Parsons to provide input. I took that input and crafted this sentence and sent it to Roderick to check.
And of course, he moderates it to some extent. But was this reflecting the views of Paula Venables that had already been disseminated? Or were the people that you say are responsible for this text quite confident that this pre-packed approach would be accepted by the CEO? This obdurate opposition to the appeals would be accepted without demur by the CEO?
I don't know. And I think in hindsight, the CEO's report was the wrong place to be. CEO's report covers a number of major topics in very brief detail, as you see, really short paragraphs. It's really clear in hindsight this wasn't appropriate for covering this information. I wasn't the right person to be the intermediary of this. In hindsight, this warranted a separate full briefing note from the legal team, and that's what should have gone to the board.
I want to deal with the unsafe witness in conclusion one final time. The evidence base by October the 23rd, I suggest, was that Paula Venables knew that Gareth Jenkins was unsafe. She knew that he had given evidence against Seema Misra, and she decided not to disclose that to the CCRC or Mrs. Misra's lawyers. You knew that, didn't you?
No.
And in June 2013, because there is a run-up to this, in June 2013, it had become apparent, had it not, that Gareth Jenkins had disclosed to Second Sight the existence of bugs, errors, and defects in the Horizon system, and you were aware of that.
What I was briefed on at the time is those bugs had been passed on by the post office team. That was what's kind of contained in the briefings at the time.
Well, we've gone through this already at great length with Mr. Blake, but there was, if not consternation or near panic, there was great anxiety in the executive team. Mr. Blake has taken you, to example, to POL's 000-98778, 28th of June 2013, where Gareth Jenkins writes the email saying, "Leslie attached is my final witness statement for the Misra case. This was heard in Guildford Crown Court in October 2010 and concerned the West Byfleet Post Office." And you get a copy of that email. It's forwarded to you. It's the 28th of June. So you know that Gareth Jenkins has given evidence against Seema Misra, and you also know that Gareth Jenkins has caused a problem in the disclosure, or rather non-disclosure, of bugs, don't you?
No, the second half of that is not correct.
Well, you knew that he was the person who had spoken to Second Sight.
I did not know that, no.
And I suggest that's all in the context of him suppressing the evidence of bugs, errors, and defects as confided to Second Sight, and you were well aware of that.
That's not correct.
And then on the 1st of July, there's a high-level briefing for the board, POL 000-60587, and Mrs. Misra is mentioned in the context of her trial. And then we've seen again with Mr. Blake taking to it, the strapline is re-PV and AP brief. It's POL 001 1992. The board had to have a line on historic prosecutions. Do you remember that this morning? That you needed to have a line on historic prosecutions. That again is connected to Gareth Jenkins because he was the flawed expert who had failed to disclose bugs, errors and defects. You must accept that.
I'm afraid I didn't follow all of that. Could we break that down? And which specific documents and points in time are you referring to? I'm afraid
I think Mr. Henry is right in the sense we did go through that this morning, so I don't think I need to have it again, right. Mr. Henry.
Right, certainly, sir. You knew, because you drafted the briefing for Paula Venables, that Gareth Jenkins had given evidence against Seema Misra. You must accept that.
I saw that witness statement which Leslie Saul forwarded, yes.
And also, you actually drafted it as well on the 1st of July for, forgive me, POL, no need to take you to it, POL 0011 3367. It's a document you've seen, but at page 1 of 13, you raised the issue of James Arbuthnot perhaps reviving historic prosecutions, and at page 5 of 13, you raised the issue that Gareth Jenkins had given evidence against Seema Misra. So,
I'm sorry, I don't.
You don't really.
Well, I don't recognise that. Sorry.
Let's quickly go to that document then. POL 0011 3367.
This isn't a document I produced.
But you certainly saw it.
I saw it, yes.
Yes, and you read it.
I believe so. Yes.
And let's scroll up, please, on page 1. Do you see paragraph 8?
Yes.
Clear risk identified. Could we go to page 5, please? And we can see paragraph 30, the Falkirk anomaly, etc., etc. Subparagraph B, the prosecution expert Gareth Jenkins from Fujitsu, etc., etc. So what I'm trying to establish through you is that both your state of mind and Paula Venables' state of mind is that Gareth Jenkins was the expert and Gareth Jenkins had given evidence against Seema Misra.
I think, yes, that's evidence from this.
And that you, therefore, both of you were aware of that at the time of the conversation on the 21st of October 2013, which was about a week after the Altman General Review. You were both aware of the significance of the unsafe witness in relation to not 5 cases, but that one specific case concerning Seema Misra.
Candidly, I don't recall drawing a specific link back to this document, which I saw 4 or 5 minutes earlier.
Is that it, Mr. Henry?
That's it, sir.
Thank you. Before we get the next one, could you just, Mr. Henry, confirm the reference you gave for the notes of the meeting, which is described in paragraph 13 of the witness statement? I wasn't sure that I got it down accurately.
Certainly, sir. Do you want me to give it to you now?
Yeah, I'll read it to you. It's Paul 002 95635 is what I've written.
That's correct, sir.
That's correct. Fine.
That's correct. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, fine. While we're waiting for the next set of questions, can I ask you, Mr. Edwards, in the email of October when Ms. Venables said that you were briefed, told Ms. Perkins that you were briefed if she needed any more information. Nobody's asked you the direct question, but just in case, did Ms. Perkins ask you any questions or ask you to explain anything further following that email?
No, sir. I don't recall any follow-up from Alice
Fine.
Perkins.
Right, fine, thanks. Yes, who's next?
It's Miss Watt.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Edwards. I ask questions on behalf of the NFSP. I think it's fair to say that there are few survivors at the Post Office today from what we might term the Paula Venos era, and I think you and Roderick Williams are among the main ones. Is that correct?
I'm one of the few people from that area, yes.
And you're currently the Network Strategy and Delivery Director, and you advised Mr. Blake this morning this involves working with the Sub-Postmaster Network. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think it's the case that you currently have a senior role in a wide range of business decisions that affect sub-postmasters, broadly including things such as, for instance, the number of sub-post office branches in the network, the number of sub-postmasters in the network, financial packages, decisions on closure of branches, compensation in the hard-to-place scheme, and generally just a great deal of what affects sub-postmasters today. Would that be fair?
Yes.
So thinking about that, taking account of that, and given the evidence that we've heard from you today about your knowledge and role in working with the former Chief Executive Paula Venos and Horizon-related issues, including some things that we saw you had comments you had made, such as making sure sub-postmasters don't get off scot-free, in other words, escape deserved punishment and such like. Would you accept that it is a significant, should be and can be a significant concern to the sub-postmaster network of today and those representing them, that you should be in a role now that affects their working and financial relationships?
I think that's a question for others to judge. As I mentioned in my evidence earlier, I fully accept I was caught up in part of the groupthink back in 2013, and I don't believe I provided enough challenge. I didn't step outside the mindset at the time, and I deeply regret that. I think I have learnt a huge amount from that, and I think I am still able to do a good job for the business and for postmasters, but it's ultimately for others to judge that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watt. Is it Mr. Maloney now?
It is, yes.
Mr. Edwards, I simply want to ask you very briefly about Project Zebra and the Deloitte report.
Yes.
In 2013-2014, you were aware that there was an issue around remote access.
Yes.
Yeah. And the Deloitte report for Project Zebra was delivered in mid-2014.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you read that report, Mr. Edwards?
I didn't, no.
Did you read the board's summary?
No. All I recall reading on this, I wasn't particularly closely involved with the matters at this point, so I recall reading a summary email from Chris O'Jord to the board, but I didn't read the report itself.
Did you discuss the findings of the report with Mrs. Venables?
No, I wasn't closely involved with matters at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards.
Is that it, Mr. Blake?
That is, yes, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Edwards, for making your witness statement and for giving evidence orally before me today. I'm grateful to you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
2 days next week, starting on Monday, Mr. Blake.
That's correct.
All right, 9:45. It's one witness on Monday. I take it we still want to start at 9:45, do we?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Fine. All right.